first lecture in the Tecnoglass series. Before I get into the Tecnoglass series, let me remind you that actually this is one several series and public programs we have. We have the high noon series on which is a lunchtime lecture that is usually devoted to research. Work in progress is meant to be more informal. This term is highlighting actually the work of our own faculty and more precisely recent public books by our own faculty. The current series is a lecture that is not planned long in advance because it's meant to capitalize, on opportunities. We hear that somebody we like a lot is in town, we grab them for the lecture. Not quite that fast, but unlike the Tecnoglass, it's not planned because the Tecnoglass is actually a themed lecture. It has a kind of overarching theme addressing some of the issues that we are here very interested in, and it changes every year or every term. And my colleague, Joel Lemire, has been delegated with the responsibility of orchestrating the series this year. And he's responsible also for defining the theme, and he will shortly tell you more about it. But I want to take the opportunity now to thank our sponsors, Tecnoglass, who have been actually supporting this very important piece of our public programs for the 7th year. We're very grateful because they allow us to sustain this high level of programming, and we hope to continue with this partnership. And now let me introduce Joel, who's going to tell you more about this series.
Thank you. So my understanding is behind the glass, I'm able to take this off, and so will our speaker, which make things a little more articulate for everybody. So good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is our first Tecnoglass lecture of the academic year, as Rodolphe mentioned, and so thank you, Rodolphe, for starting us off this evening. And in particular, I'd like to reiterate his thanks to Tecnoglass, our sponsor. Personally, as this year's curator, it's been almost like a self-indulgent joy to use this platform to invite both established and emergent voices in the field. Tecnoglass has basically empowered that entirely, and for that, I thank them very much. A couple brief pieces of housekeeping before I introduce our lecturer for this evening, Mr. Stephen Lewis. First, because this lecture is an in-person event and simulcast on Zoom, there is some etiquette to follow. I believe that we're a webinar, so hopefully no microphones can be turned on or screen shares, but if you are watching that way, please don't do that. Secondly, as you know, the AIA offers continuing education credits for these events. So if you're interested in receiving those credits, it's important for you to email Stephen Fett at the address that you see on the screen right there, sfett@miami.edu. He asks that you email him with the name of the event, the Stephen Lewis lecture, and your AIA number, preferably. All right, also, we would be remiss not to mention today that today is the beginning of Yom Kippur, and so we apologize to our observant Jewish colleagues who could not join us today because of the scheduling. All right, and finally, because as we've mentioned, this is the first lecture in the series this year, I wanted to take a moment to introduce the fall theme. It will be clear why Stephen Lewis is a key contributor to this conversation and the perfect character to kick this thing off. Go, okay. Opting in, urgent questions, architectural responses. This lecture series foregrounds radical architecture for fraught times. Those individuals and collectives who have opted to pursue design as the means to address seemingly intractable and entangled issues. Our global moment is characterized by parallel crises: accelerating climate change, rampant economic inequities, structural oppression by race and gender, intensifying refugee movement, and militarizing borders, among others. Architecture is implicated in these crises, having been a central agent in the systems that engendered them, but it also resists. We highlight practices that acknowledge this condition, understand it as a product of interwoven systemic issues, engage these larger debates, but resist complicity through their work. So there are 5 speakers over the course of just the fall, and as many more to come in the spring. All are great designers and architects, like that they have in common with one another, but they are as importantly a very diverse set of people and voices. After all, architecture's canon can be retooled only once we platform diverse practitioners in their work. The lecturers are also generationally diverse. Some are acclaimed and established, others are emerging and promising. This cross-generational mix serves to illustrate how long a haul this is, how the mantle of these struggles needs to be passed to those that follow us, to the students in this room, and their students in turn. So in short, we can opt in or we can opt out. We can see architecture as a potential agent, of positive change, and dedicate ourselves to that. Or to paraphrase Manfredo Tafuri's bleak alternative, we can quit and join the party. Stephen Lewis has clearly done the former. He has opted in to the tune of more than 35 years of humanist-oriented practice. He has opted in at many scales and in many contexts, including as a founding partner of RAW International in 1984, as a Loeb Fellow at Harvard's Graduate School of Design, as the president of the National Organization of Minority Architects from 2009 to 2011, as urban design director for the Central District of Detroit, and now as a principal at ZGF, just to name a few. And because I know he intends to speak to some of his personal history today, I won't summarize all of his vast experiences in some sort of like pithy list, right? I imagine that his self-reflection will do that history a lot more justice. But suffice it to say, he has a remarkable record of engagement with questions of equity, of community mentorship and leadership, and is recognized nationally as a leading advocate for diversity in the profession of architecture. His accolades are evidence of his reach, including the 2016 Whitney M. Young Jr. Award from the AIA, an award whose mission actually is to recognize progressive values and social responsibility in architecture. We could obviously use so much more of that, so, no doubt. So I am honored to have him join us today. On behalf of the School of Architecture at the University of Miami and Tecnoglass, please welcome me in joining Stephen Lewis.
Should be able to just advance.
Thank you, Joel. I think you called me old somewhere in those remarks, but that's fine. Looks are deceiving. Yes. Good evening, everyone. And thank you for having me as the first live body in the auditorium in quite some time. Since we last were here, much has changed. The pandemic, in particular, the unfortunate events of Minneapolis with George Floyd's murder, that as a result of the pandemic, most of us were home watching on TV in utter disbelief, but not utter disbelief. Just like for some of us whose lived experiences have included these incidents going back as far as we can study, it was just, here we go again, except you all were watching this time. And with that came this moment, this instant of awakening and reckoning that we are now living through. How long we will sustain the attention on these inequities that are underlying what happened is going to be up to you. And as I sunset in my career, eventually, I will be sitting back watching in great hopes and anticipation of what you all will bring to this opportunity, shall we say. So I'm going to share with you tonight, I think the best way to kind of inspire you as young people entering the profession, or those of you who have been in it, who may be wondering how, as things are shifting and changing, you adapt and change yourselves. I would hope that what I share tonight will provide some source of inspiration and communicate from a cultural standpoint this thing that we Black folks call Black joy, which is something that we have needed to survive all of the oppression since the days we first arrived on these shores. And, you know, I speak clearly as a person who identifies as a Black man, not so much because of my skin color, but because of how I've been classified by this society, the one drop rule, and what I choose to see as virtue and value in a quest that will make us all better, make us live out and live up to that perfect union that was described once in documents that were the founding documents of this country. So what I want to talk about tonight, basically, I'm going to trace my path, this moment of awakening, of inspiration, and then what it all created in terms of my compelled movement toward things that need we architects as I don't want to say problem solvers, but people to lead in creative and intellectual and innovative ways of addressing systemic things that have found their way to the surface, while our activities, as great as we think we all are, have laid underneath the decision-making bodies that have created much of the situations that we're trying to reckon with today. This notion of being a citizen architect, it's nothing I created. The AIA actually has a portion of the website that you can go to and look at the criteria. And if you've served on a school board, design review committee, public office, or anything that is contributing to the public good, you can fill out the little form and check the box and count yourself among those growing numbers of us who are counting ourselves as citizen architects. You'll see through my presentation this kind of ping pong existence between private practice and public service, which I've come to understand has given me incredible insight and value as I go back and forth between one and the other. Oh, I'm done. This time I'm sticking on the private side of things, and that's just the way it's going to be. I'll use the work in Detroit as an illustration of some of how, when you're trying to move a place forward that seems ready to receive all the investment and what comes with it, gentrification, how you manage that and are able to receive that without displacing longtime residents who either didn't have the economic opportunity to move out when everything was going down the drain, or because they were so fiercely proud as Detroiters, just insisted on staying. And now, how do they get the opportunity to remain, be seen, be viewed, be respected, and become not the beginning of a new history, but the continuation of the history that they began? And then lastly, I'll just go more directly into what I call architecture in the age of Jedi, justice, equity, diversity, inclusion. And if George Lucas was in the room, I think I'd be in trouble because we're not supposed to really use that. But anyway, it's all for the good. So beginning with how I started, like many of us as young people, I was innocent. You know, I had a father, Roger C. Lewis, who's an architect. And so I grew up in a house, the head of household as an architect. So as the oldest of four, I was always kind of under his wing. And instead of, you know, GI Joes and other things, I was using yellow tracing paper and magic markers and stuff like that. So I was being programmed before I realized it. Even though when I made my decision to actually go into architecture as a major at Syracuse University, he was not encouraging me at that time, but by that time it was too late. So, you know, I was born in '56, and by the time I was, you know, with my brother who's 2 years younger, sister 2 years younger than him, we'd get around and we'd watch TV. These are the shows that we watched: Donna Reed, Dennis the Menace, Andy Griffith. And we were innocent and young. And as we looked at those families, they were like our family. We sat down and had dinner. You know, we had conversations. We got spankings when we were bad, all that good stuff. And we had no racial awareness, self-awareness. And then you turn the channel and you see this. And it's like, what's going on here? And my parents were, you know, products of coming through the civil rights era. And so I was privy to those conversations, and they were not shy about sharing, because they wanted me and my siblings to be aware of, this was kind of before you heard the kind of conversations about, you know, you have to have the talk, you know, about if you encounter a police officer, you got to behave this way and do that. It wasn't quite like that. It was more systemic and structural. And in my dad's case, working for majority-owned firms, a graduate of Howard University, I'll get to him right here. Raj is my man. He left us about 4 years ago at age 88 with no regrets, a full, beautiful life of inspiration, not only to me, but to so many others. But he launched his practice in 1970 with two partners. And that was a moment in time in New York City where a number of Black architects left their positions with majority-owned firms and started their own practices. And a lot of it was because of opportunities that Housing and Urban Development was providing by focusing on restoring inner city communities. My dad was born and raised in Harlem. And so a lot of his practice was at restoring tenement buildings and brownstones that had been worn out by, doom and gloom over the years. And so as they began to practice, they coalesced in a group, which is part of now the National Organization of Minority Architects, NOMA. At the time, it was NYCOBA, the New York Coalition of Black Architects. And I was a kid sitting in the room listening to these conversations about what happened when you went to the building department to have a plan review. And the person told you, oh, you can just leave that set of drawings over there, like you were delivering the plans or something. And there were like so many indignities that they withstood. And like salmon trying to find their spawning grounds, they swam upstream against the rapids and against all odds, and they persevered. And they did what they did in that time that was so essential. One of the things, moving from awakening to inspiration, that later in my life, as I entered architecture school, went through it, graduated, and then had a moment of reflection. How is it that I actually, beyond, because first of all, growing up in the house, being part of his office scene and stuff, I thought I really understood architecture, but there was no theory in that. There was not a lot of the things that we in these institutions get to enjoy or not enjoy, whatever. But I had to sort of think back on what got into my DNA to make me want to do this. And I went to school and actually found out how different the education was from what I thought it would be as observed in my dad's practice. And so I actually fell in love with architecture on my own terms. It was just amazing. But why? And then I thought back, oh, when I was 8 years old, my dad was part of a small team that designed the Venezuelan pavilion at the 64-65 New York City World's Fair. And I remember distinctly seeing a chipboard model of this hyperbolic parabola on the dining room table. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. And then I got dragged out to the site during the construction of the World's Fair. So I'm just like looking around, the helicopter comes, drops the Unisphere down, and the buildings are going on, and all this construction, and it's amazing. And then they complete the fair, and the fair opens, and we as a family go to the fair. And of course, at 8 years old, I wanted to be an astronaut. So the Science and Technology Pavilion really captured my interest, and I was spending all my time over there. But this became the symbol of possibility. And we went to the GM building exhibit, and you go in and you get in this little car on a track, and it rides you through the city of the future. I mean, it took a long time for me to realize what an impression that made. And it did, but so did this. I'm getting older now, and I'm starting to ask these questions. I'm starting to do a little homework and research and understand, wow, this Dr. King is this huge figure. Black folks don't have a lot to grab onto that's exceptional at this point, acknowledged by all, and Dr. King was one of those figures. And when JFK went down, and then Bobby went down, and then Dr. King went down, and Malcolm X went down, and Medgar Evers went down, and just time after time, it yanked the heart out of what would have been a movement that probably would have advanced us further had it been able to continue back then. So what did I do? I went to Jamaica, home of my paternal side, and had to stand under Duns River Falls to contemplate my life. And in that moment of cognition, I figured I better go ahead and do this. So I wound up at Syracuse University. My father's a graduate of Howard University and HBCU. I opted to go to a majority institution. And there was no room for ideas outside of the paradigm and the pedagogy of those in charge, which in our case, after 2 years of sort of floundering, Werner Seligman came and became Dean of the Architecture School. And boy, did that start the absolute heyday for Syracuse University School of Architecture. A few faculty that are still hanging around always romantically refer to the times when we were there as the golden age of Syracuse. And a lot of it was, sort of very figure ground based, very Corbusian in a certain way. And so to try to introduce elements of design that were outside of that paradigm, not really, no one's really wanting to hear that. Not that we were even aware we students, a few of us Black students who were there, that we had cultural underpinnings that we could reach back to and grab that really kind of explain a lot of what happened in Europe eventually. And so we're just starting to uncover those things right now. And if for those of you who are interested and have the time, I would highly recommend looking at some of the Henry Louis Gates Jr. series. He has 3 that are pretty profound. One of them is The African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross. The other one, which was really informative to me, was Africa's Great Civilizations. And then there's one on the Reconstruction period that happened after slavery, which was about a 10-year period where Blacks, once freed, were able to prosper and own property and businesses. And there were 8 congressmen who were Black. And that was just going too far, too fast for the general society. And the Jim Crow laws came into being, and we still haven't recovered from them. Okay, so enough of that. I chose to assimilate into that culture. I kind of in my own way radiated, but I mostly assimilated. And this was pre-computer, so we were all in our desks, like it was a giant space full of drafting tables. I miss those days. Actually, I have a drawing board with a parallel edge set up at home, and I just draw for therapy sometimes now. You should try it. But in 1984, I moved to California in 1980, and I sort of found myself into a job with a redevelopment agency, and that was my first foray into public service. I worked for the Community Redevelopment Agency of the City of Los Angeles as a planning associate, and that was completely eye-opening, and it was a chance to work toward a better life for communities that really were in need. The redevelopment agency was attacking systemic problems that were affecting certain communities and trying to use their leverage and agency power to affect positive change. And so for me, it felt very natural. It was cool. After 2 years, my dad decided he was going to move out of his partnership, and we had a little kind of desire to work together. So I moved us back to New York at the worst possible time. We had a recession that hit right away. I actually had to go on unemployment for about 4 months, whatever. And while I was sneakily working for him on the side, because when you're on unemployment, you're not supposed to be working for anybody, but I wasn't getting paid, so it was all good. But when my wife and I came back to our home in LA 2 years later, ran into a colleague who had left a major firm that he had been working for, Greenway Associates, the inventor of the shopping mall as we know it, and had started a sole practice. And we had so much synergy about what we were trying to do that we decided to become partners at that time. And that was the birth of RAW International. And when people say, well, what does RAW stand for? I'd say, stripped of the unessentials, pure, it's Roland A. Wiley. Okay, so whatever. He's the guy on the left of the left picture. And Stephen Lott on the other side had left architecture altogether after working for Gruen and then Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. He was fed up with architecture, and he is from LA. Roland's from Indianapolis, and I was from New York. So we had East Coast, Midwest, West Coast all covered. What a great story we had. And we did not take any of the affirmative action projects that were made available to us initially because we believed in design, and we wanted to make it or break it on our design chops. We were very, very fortunate and lucky that we had a string of clients that gave us great exposure. One of them being the Pacific Design Center, the building done by Cesar Pelli, within which you had all these product manufacturer showrooms. And we were the tenant improvement architects. So we were doing like the handicap upgrades to the restrooms and the PDC. They had a series of 3 public telephones, if you know what those are, things you used to drop coins into and dial, and they said, well, we need to make those accessible too. So not only did we make them accessible, but there were 3 buildings that Pelli designed as part of the complex, what's affectionately called the Blue Whale, which is the original Pacific Design Center. But then there was a red building and a green building. And so we took the profile of the section of each of those buildings and used that in its appropriate color to be the dividers between the telephones. And the management of the Pacific Design Center said, wow, man, that's pretty creative. So that when Armstrong World Industries or a carpet company or someone looking at renting space would come in, they'd say, we're going to rent 5,000 feet. Who should we look at? And they said, well, Gensler's down the block, and HOK's over there. Hey, but there's this young group, RAW, and they're really creative, and they do that stuff. And so we started designing showrooms, which is like going to a birthday party every day. These things are going to be there for what, 2 years max, 3 maybe. So you get to really just like design crazy stuff that symbolically represents who that client and their product is. And we had a great run. I think at the end of the day, we had designed as a firm more showrooms in that center than any other single firm had. And that led to the adjoining town of Beverly Hills. We had a lot of these very wealthy doctors, many of them plastic surgeons, who would get dragged to the Pacific Design Center by their interior decorators to look at carpet or tile or fixtures, and they would see a showroom and they'd say, hey, who did that? I want my office to look like that because my office has to be better than Dr. So-and-so's down the hall. And we started calling our number, and all of a sudden we're designing these high-end medical office suites in Beverly Hills doctors' offices. And so the story goes on and on. We had good luck like that. Kaiser Permanente needed Black architects to start becoming more diverse in the work they did. They looked at our portfolio. They just didn't say a word. They got up and left, and the next day there was a contract on our desk. So this is a very sort of fortuitous run that we had. But the slide also, it shows the 20 years from 84 to 2004, which is the time that I was there with my partners before I left to flip back over on the public service side. And I went to work for who then was the chief architect at the US General Services Administration, Ed Feiner, who really principally built up the GSA's Design Excellence Program. So the federal inventory of buildings went from buildings that no one would compete for because no one wanted to do those 1960s, industrial boxes that, were soulless. They turned it all around. And instead of like the firm that killed the most trees and had the fattest proposal getting the job, you now could submit and compete with a 1/4 of an inch thick lead designer's portfolio. We all of a sudden wanted to see the thinking of the designer because we realized that, hey, if Steve Lewis has this incredible idea for this project, we can award him and he can walk down the street and get DPZ to be his architect of record or whatever. Those strategies were available. And so I won a Design Excellence Award for a child care center in 1995. That sort of made me known to Ed and the central office in DC. And eventually I was asked if I would come on board and really sort of help from the inside on both the diversity stuff, but also the fact that they had been such a close client of mine that I understood their inner workings and was able to, in my life, I have walked up to the edge of the abyss time after time. And as I've peered down into it, I've seen nothing but blackness, nothing clear. And instead of backing away from it in fear, I've leapt into that abyss. And I found every time that it's been a warm and fuzzy place. So I encourage you all to not be scared, to go for things, because it really can be rewarding. Well, after GSA, I had a run of several private sector jobs that were each leading me in a slightly different direction, but always sort of upwardly mobile, if you will, until I got a phone call in 2016 from my good friend and colleague, Maurice Cox. Some of you may be familiar with Maurice. He taught at UVA. He was the design director for the National Endowment for several years. He then was hired by the mayor of Detroit to be the planning department director and to rebuild that planning department. And he now is the planning commissioner in the city of Chicago. But when he got to Detroit, he called me and some of his other friends and said, we need you here. And I basically said, well, let's cut to the chase. How much money you got? He said, oh, the city of Detroit's coming out of bankruptcy and this, that, and the other thing. And I said, well, what do you got? And he told me, and I was like, I know a lot of smart people, a little younger, they can probably do it for that, but I can't. Okay. A month later, he calls back and he says, all right, I've just talked to Monica Ponce de Leon and got you a teaching appointment at Michigan. So you can do the city job and then you can go out to Michigan and teach a studio or whatever, and you can get 30 grand from that. I'm like, all right, here I go again, leap in. And so we went to Detroit. We rented our house once again in Los Angeles for the third time, different home this time. I rented it with the notion that we would one day come back. And then we went to Detroit, and it was the most amazing professional experience of my life. When you want to talk about the merger of a city trying to redefine its excellence through design, through elevating design after 40 years of nothing being built, and now all of a sudden stuff's flowing in, and you need to really, really be careful not just like be so hungry that you accept whatever they're bringing in the door. And Maurice got a bullseye on his back, particularly from the local AIA and local architects, because we started bringing in, you know, Merrill and Liz and Andreas and whoever from the outside to elevate the whole level. And it was not appreciated by them, but the city sure appreciated it. And now we have evidence coming out of the ground all over the place. You have to visit Detroit. If you can't go physically, go virtually, do some Google Street View stuff, move around the area, because it's just remarkable. It's remarkable. So that was my most recent flurry with the public sector. You can do so much good if you care. And then if you can bring that sensibility back into the private sector, which I've fortunately been able to do at ZGF because they've welcomed me and they've welcomed that. And why did I choose ZGF? Gensler was yanking on me hard and I almost shook that hand, but then I asked for one more moment to consider, and I had a reckoning of my own, which was that in 1995, Raw was the associate architect with ZGF on a major California Science Center project down in Exposition Park in Los Angeles, right across from USC. And when we did that project, we had a defined scope. First part of our scope was to do the historic preservation package for the Rose Garden facade of a historic building that we were going to maintain while ZGF's new superstructure would rise from behind it. But at the face of that would be that historic facade. And then we were assigned two of the major exhibits inside of the museum, the World of Life and Virtual World, where we worked with the exhibit designer to actually do the CDs and the construction administration. But ZGF from the very beginning said, you know, we really want you at the table to discuss the entire project and the design because, and maybe it was because that Exposition Park area is surrounded by a low-income Black neighborhood and they knew we had, you know, sensibilities that way. Or maybe it was just their culture that they wanted to have various diversity of voices and thoughts and lived experiences all contribute to what would then become a pretty amazing award-winning project. But I thought about that at the 11th hour and I made my decision and I made the right choice because I'm part of that family who love me and who I love very much. And it's a pleasure to go to work there. So anyway, just a little snapshot of some of the stuff we did at Raw. And if you see the yellow plywood angled childcare stuff and the red inverted cone or the red cones next to it, those are from the Little Aviators Childcare Center that won the GSA citation for interiors. And then some of the other work you see, the black steel pagoda was an Asian artifact showroom at the Pacific Design Center. The one to the right of that with the sort of record labels in the glass was Motown Records corporate headquarters, 66,000 square feet on a single floor of a building in Los Angeles, and so on and so forth. So, okay, who are we, citizen architects? How do we qualify? I talked a little about that in the beginning. And, you know, if you give genuinely and sincerely and you touch a certain number of people, not with that being your intent, but as a result of your work, you can be recognized. And so it was that I was recognized as someone who they wanted to feature in this booklet that they put out from time to time called Living Your Life as a Leader. And that's that piece. And on the right, it's me signing a memorandum of understanding between NOMA and the AIA with Dean Marvin Malika, who sadly we lost to cancer last year. But Marvin had left Cal Poly Pomona and gone to the new school down in San Diego and made his mark there before he unfortunately had to pass away. So while all this is going on, I thought it would be good and it would be something, well, it was something I wanted to do to start my own consulting practice, which from time to time since 2011 has been active when necessary and dormant when I'm like fully engaged in a practice like I am right now. But it's called Thinking Leadership. It's like a noun and a verb. It's who we are and it's what we do. And it's consulting with leaders, primarily civic leaders, mayors of cities, on bringing the importance of how we think and process stuff to the forefront of how they're looking at their problems. And so I've had the real pleasure to have worked with several mayors around the country. And in fact, I convened a Mayor's Institute on City Design, just sort of yanked it out of my own bag of tricks, and the NEA was all for it. And I had 7 mayors from around the country go to Birmingham, Alabama, and be hosted by one of those mayors, who was Mayor William Bell at the time, Mayor of Birmingham. And I brought together 8 of my what's called resource team members. And I decided to bring a diversity of professions to that table to help these mayors, each of them having had to grapple with some kind of natural disaster. In Birmingham was the tornado that just leveled Pratt City, one of the inner excerpts. That was the floods in Paterson, New Jersey. It was, one thing after another. And it was the most remarkable time to sit. Mayors aren't allowed to bring their staffs. They have to be present in the room. And we were able to really work with them and work out their issues. And they left in 2 days just sort of all inspired. And so that program, the MIDC, the Mayor's Institute on City Design, is really, really incredible. This presentation is obviously being recorded, so I'm not going to waste the time and let you read and me recite any of these things. But I'd rather spend a minute going through what I consider to be core values that define us as citizen architects. Honesty, be unafraid of the truth. It's going to get more complicated if you start off in a different direction. Have integrity, say what you mean what you say. Be transparent, don't be afraid. Have empathy to understand, where the issues are and to let that strengthen your spine and give you purpose in what you do. And you can do this at every scale. It might just mean that you get the courage to speak to a client in a meeting where you're like a grunt and no one's expecting you to say anything. And if you see something going down and you want to just express yourself, you have to be courageous and you have to do that. So humility, people like me who are type A's, who you yak, often will say stuff and no one's checking us. And when Laura says, hey, well, ho, I'm checking you on that, be humble and say, process that. And you grow and you get stronger when you're humble and you can receive criticism and new ideas. And ultimately, as you all know very well as students in this program, you have to have dedication. You have to be dedicated. You got to work your behinds off and know that there is some light at the end of the tunnel. It's just a fake light, because when you get to the end of the tunnel, it just gets worse. But no, it's great. You're like in training right now. It's like training. So then what do you do with all that? I really think that this call to action, I have gone behind natural disasters and other kinds of disasters. And I happen to be a Loeb Fellow at Harvard for 2006, 2007. And our class got to go to Johannesburg at the end of the fellowship, which, as you can see by these images, illustrates both the struggle, the challenge, and yet the opportunity. The opportunity is in the innocence of the youth. They don't know their circumstances. They're smiling, they're happy. They are the future. And it's up to us to create an environment where they can flourish and become the leaders that their country is going to need in the future. And what I'll say about the image on the lower left, which I took very covertly, I should say, as we were driving down the street in Khayelitsha Township, which is down in Cape Town, where most of the fellows went on our own nickel. After the 1 week of funds for the Loeb ran out in Johannesburg, we went and decided to spend a week in Cape Town. I had been working on a community center project as a pro bono project on my own with friends who have a nonprofit operating in Khayelitsha. And so we went there to see that. And what you'll notice is that these shacks that are made of cobbled together found materials, corrugated metal, plywood, whatever people can find, they're still assembled with an intention, something, whether it's the way they're painted, the way they are articulated, that says that I have dignity, I have control over this, and I am going to express it. I'm not only going to make something that serves what I need functionally, but I'm going to make something that is just a shout into the universe about I'm here and I can do something. And I took that very much to heart after that trip. And I had 9 wonderful students from the GSD that worked with me covertly to produce the work that was ultimately built in Khayelitsha. And I called it my insurgent studio. I was telling some folks earlier that these students who signed up to help me, this wasn't a studio, and it was not sanctioned. And when the client came, when we were well into the project, and we had a pinup in Piper Auditorium, the faculty were walking around looking at this thing, looking at the group of people sitting in there, and I was hiding behind a column because they were like, where did this come from and what is this? And I was like, hey, just got to do it. So anyway, that worked out well. But the instruction to the students, because I could have designed this myself, but I felt it would be much more important for me to be sort of a conductor and allow them, just like Laura's doing with her housing studio, for those ideas to flourish. She knows she needs some stuff. I know I needed some stuff, but let those ideas ruminate and germinate and see what happens. And so my only requirement for the design of this community center is that they paid homage to this assemblage of found materials by using the contemporary materials available to us, but organizing them and arranging them in facades in ways that were recognizable as that type of expression. And, you know, it's not a building that's going to make it in an architectural record, or could, but that's not the purpose of the concern. The success is in the impact that that building, with its 3 micro business spaces, with its 2 units above for children that have recently been orphaned by AIDS to stay until they can be adopted elsewhere, has made a tremendous impact on that community. Maurice and I went to New Orleans after Katrina, and I'm also a photographer, and these are my photographs. And here's where a picture's worth like 1,000 words. If you look at that picture on the lower left, hey, guess what? The car's still in the garage. What? It's upside down. I mean, it was just hellacious. On the lower right, it's a house that's still fully intact, except it's sitting in the middle of the street. So the devastation was palpable. And it wasn't even clear what we might be able to do when we went. We just knew we had to go. Similarly with Haiti, this was when I was NOMA president and George Miller was AIA president. And we decided together that we would go and we would see for ourselves and then come back and report to our constituents in both organizations the magnitude of what we witnessed, and use that as sort of leverage to gain resources to help the communities there. And I've never seen anything like this, and they just went through it again. It's hard to imagine. You watch it on CNN, but you don't smell it, you don't taste it. You certainly do when you're on the ground, and it's sobering. But what is more remarkable than the devastation was the resilience of the people. We as Westerners come in, we're impatient, we want to see the money come in, we want to see the change happen, and then it doesn't, and then we just find the next thing and run to it. And we leave the people who are there alone to reckon with all of this. And so what happened was, as you can see in the middle upper picture, the debris just kind of got organized out on the curb, and the little shops and stands that were in the loggia before just moved out in front into the street in front of the debris, and commerce and life continued. And it was a lesson in resilience. Like, if you wake up tomorrow and you're somewhere that you couldn't imagine, you're going to find a way. You're not just going to roll over and croak, you know, you're going to find a way. And so these are hard lessons, but so valuable lessons, so valuable. Valuable in terms of how we conduct ourselves, but more as important, how we channel that into the work that we do. There was the tornado that went through Birmingham, and talk about devastation. There it is in the lower central pictures. My good friend and colleague, who was my classmate at the Loeb, her family is like generational in Birmingham, Alabama. And her dad, Pete, who was I think 86 at the time, had a Cessna, and he flew us up, and we flew down to Tuscaloosa where the tornado touched down. And as he banked around back toward Birmingham, you could see this brown swath just disappear in perspective. Like all the trees had been just nailed down, and they had turned brown. And, you know, Kathy's my friend, and we went up that day. I always wanted to be in the cockpit of a plane. I was hoping it might be a bigger jet, but taking off so you could actually see the runway and see the plane take off. And I was kind of turning green by the time we landed. But you know, before we took off, Kathy's sister and this other friend who was a photographer in the back of the plane, and I'm bunched up because it's a tight cockpit and I'm 6'4", you know, so I'm like crunched up in the front. And Kathy's sister Lee, who was taking flying lessons at the time, said to me, as we're taxiing the takeoff, said, Steve, if Pete croaks while we're up there, do you think you can move him out of the way so I can get up there and fly this plane? And I said, no, I'm just going to point the wheel down so we just finish it right there. There's no way, that's not going to work. But wow, pictures worth 1,000 words. Pivoting to Detroit, I'm going to speed up a little bit here. This is a segment of a photo I took of the Diego Rivera mural in the Detroit Institute of Arts, which is the most remarkable thing to surround yourself with. Again, got to go see it. The Michigan Central Station at its heyday was the pinnacle of Detroit's success as an industrial power. The train came in here, people went there for different commerce. This was just a beacon. And the photographers who enjoy dealing in ruin porn loved this building because it gave them the best subject matter they could find in the whole city. Well, this is what came to symbolize the city. But this is what I discovered when I arrived. This incredibly resilient group of multi-ethnic people who have deep roots in the Midwest, who come to Eastern Market every Saturday to buy their vegetables and their bacon and their ham hocks and their giant heads of cauliflower, because Michigan's a great farming state. And I like to say that anyone ever lost in the Bermuda Triangle shows up on Saturdays at Eastern Market, because the place is just crowded with people. And it was just really beautiful. And everyone, you know, talks to everyone and everybody makes eye contact. And it's just this great mashup of humanity. Again, you know, watch the media and, you know, the sensationalism. And this is what we all would see, those of us who did not know any better. But then you get there and you see that for every house that's been knocked down, there's a Mies van der Rohe townhouse that's standing in its place. And in the lower left, you see the new Q line, Quicken Loans, Dan Gilbert, the money man that really started this whole resurgence. A great surface rail that goes all of 3.1 miles. But guess what? It connects people to Henry Ford Hospital and Motown and downtown. And so it's kind of the experiment. Detroit's a series of spoke streets, and this goes up the center spine of Woodward Avenue. And the mayor's vision and hope is that we extend that surface line along many of the spoke streets, and we have a network. Upper left, you see the Mies van der Rohe Towers, the Lafayette Towers. My daughter spent a year in one of those, and now on the lower right, as part of that development, there are these really sort of famous steel and glass townhomes that are inhabited these days mostly by architects. I tried to get one, a little out of my price range. But anyway, just a beautiful city. And as a planning department, we went on a retreat at Cranbrook, and we beat each other up for a day to come up with some simple, you know, vision statements and mission statements to build the city secure in its future, grounded in its roots, and hopeful in its present state. So that was tough, you know. Put a bunch of architects in a room and try to agree on a mission statement, that's challenging. And our mantra was like planning to stay, because we really wanted to avoid displacement. That was our big mission. And so we see elements of the citizenry who have stayed and now want to be part of this. And we're, you know, always finding ways of, you know, you hear this term these days, what is black space, right? Some student told Andreas Duani, you design white space. And we were talking last night, and he's like, I had to stop for a moment and contemplate that. And then I had, all of the spaces I design are usually for like middle, upper class white people. So, yeah. So there's this notion, well, what about feeling like you belong somewhere versus going to a place and feeling like somebody might be watching you and maybe, you know, I'm not real comfortable here. In downtown Detroit on the lower left, they closed off some streets every summer and they create these basketball courts. And you go out at lunch and this is what's happening. You know, the brothers are down there balling and everybody's got a white guy in a suit and tie, takes off his jacket, grabs the ball from the brothers, shoots a jumper, goes back and gets his hot dog, his coney, as they call it there. So now I'm going to share this one project that SOM was brought on board to do, the Riverfront framework plan. Detroit's industrial riverfront being reimagined as a vibrant place of a mixed use neighborhood. And so you're going to see some before and afters. And you see in the background the Renaissance Center, the John Portman building, And those white volumes you see in the foreground are part of GM's new plan that I think they're working with Gensler on to develop housing and retail so that they can house their workforce within a walk of their workplace. Sound familiar, Laura? Yeah, 20-minute neighborhoods. And so that whole plan produced a 30-year vision, 22 million square feet of development. And when we presented it to the mayor, he said, well, that's all beautiful and perfect and everything, but guess what? You need to identify those things out of this entire plan that are implementable within a 3-year period, because people don't have patience beyond that. If you say in year 10, you're going to deliver something, by year 3, they're already accusing you of not delivering. So all of the things that you can do in 3 years, that's what I want you to focus on. So we came up with these 4 strategies: parks and green open space, because we can control that portion of the riverfront and restore that habitat, much like it was in the days of river farms and, you know, the fur traders and all that good stuff. Greenways, which were built by Coleman A. Young, who was the first Black mayor of Detroit in 1970, and he was in office for 20 years. He was the best in his first 10. Got a little corrupt after that, but during those 10, he extended these green walkways up north into the neighborhoods, many of whom were low-income neighborhoods, that provided them with sort of pleasant access down to the major east-west spoke street and further over to the riverfront. So you'll see how we were able to move in and restore those fingers. This was a site where you see the tensile structure kind of in front of that bridge in the background, the Ambassador Bridge. And that was one of the improvements made by the Detroit Riverfront Conservancy, along with this wetland, this minor wetland. The code at the time we arrived would have allowed private development of this scale to get this close to the riverfront. So we pushed that line back north, and we extended that wetlands to be much more significant. And as you go further east toward the Belle Isle Bridge, this is a site called the Uniroyal site, which is very contaminated, and it's almost finished being cleaned up. And when it is, it becomes the extension of the Riverwalk. The mayor said, the riverfront is for the people. So let's create a robust public amenity all along that riverfront. And that was sort of the marching orders. So we engaged members of the Detroit community, the broader community, who many of whom were, you know, had had so much taken from them that they didn't want to hope for a better future. And we had to, I won't say convince, but share information in a way that they were able to come to that decision themselves and feel like they had a stake in what was going to happen. And then they felt like they could own it and support it. This is one of those, you know, fingers that went up into the neighborhood, and you can see how dilapidated it looks. And with the assistance of the Detroit Riverfront Conservancy, again, this is what's happening right now. This is a render, but they're actually building it out. And the red stanchion is a call box that happens every 300 feet. So if you ever ran into some trouble, you're not far from being able to call. And there's a legion of security folks on bicycles that gets dispatched from that area that you saw in the other image with the tensile structures. And then within minutes, they arrive at any of these places. East Jefferson is that east-west lower spoke street. And it's like these major spoke streets are like 6-lane roads. They were built for what was anticipated as being like 2 million residents. And at its height, Detroit was about 1.7. And since 1950, that's been declining. And when I showed up, it was about 650,000. So you've got this excess capacity on these streets. So what the hell do you do with it? You know, you create a pedestrian bikeable kind of situation, which the old time drivers of Detroit hated. You know, this old woman came to a public meeting with the mayor. And when the mayor had a public meeting, we'd all have to go. And anyone like you in the audience who had a gripe could stand in one of 2 lines in front of a microphone. And we'd be there till the last person spoke. And often that was 10:30 at night. And this one senior citizen came up to the mic and she said, Mr. Mayor, I don't know about all these bike lanes. I have a hard enough time driving without them, you know. And it's just like, well, what are you doing with a license? You know, but anyway, it's you run into all kinds of funny stuff at these meetings. But this actually we implemented as an interim test with using mostly paint and the plastic stanchions that you can install. And the idea was that once the citizenry got used to it, we'd make more permanent improvements. like you see in the center median with the stormwater management stuff, because Detroit floods a lot as well. Atwater Street is the street that runs east-west closest to the riverfront that we pushed all that development back to. And the vision for that was to have a vibrant mixed-use development of density along that edge. And then the character of the district was industrial. That's what it was, right? And some of it still is. And so we believe in authenticity. And so our charge was to imagine what that could look like when you do adaptive reuse and infill and respect that fabric. Okay. Something cut off there. So this was the final plan that we were never able to roll out to the public, but we used to, look at before we went to bed every night and say, wow, be nice one day. And of course, Detroit, the home of Aretha, was all about RESPECT for nature, for beauty, mobility, for history, rich, so certainly for local talent and entrepreneurs, respect for work, formerly incarcerated returning citizens bound together in the Greening of Detroit organization that helps preserve the landscapes of neighborhoods that they once were gangbanging in. So, one guy got his certificate and he literally cried, I mean, not the teardrop that got tattooed on him, but the real one. So big respect for community voices. Maurice built a staff that was more ethnically reflective of that city, which is an 80% Black city. So we had people of all ethnicities working together, and we presented this united front of diversity to the city. And I had that privilege of teaching at Michigan a design studio in the winter session, but in the fall I had to create a seminar course. So I decided to do designing with community, and found immediately that many of the students at Michigan were hungry for that kind of information, and they got to come into Detroit and from Ann Arbor and attend some real community meetings and see us in action. And a couple of them work for ZGF now, one in the DC office, one in my LA office, former students. It's really great. Big C means that all y'all can come be ZGF one day too. I'll see you and recognize you, and it'll all be good. All right, lastly, kind of pivoting to the architecture in the age of Jedi, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. I'll probably get in trouble for stealing this image too, but hey, I don't care, because we do need lightsabers to deal with this stuff. Yeah, this is the day the world changed. We all watched. I'll talk about, as a large firm, what we're doing as a model for what some are doing and others can do, and of any size firm. So we have 6 offices, and each office has a Jedi task force now. I have given each of them 7 Black-owned firms that they have to contact, 3 this year that they have to actually develop a relationship with, which means it's not calling them about a project pursuit, saying, hey, we want to partner with you on this project. It's like, hey, we're woke now, and we noticed you, and guess what? You look really interesting. Would you care to tell us your story? Let us share a little bit about us. And hey, if an opportunity comes up, love to be able to, think about you, and you think about us. We've already got a couple of those things that are executed and in the pipeline. I've created a program called Lift Our Voices Equally for Change, the acronym being LOVE. Love for Change, where I have a monthly guest. I've had an amazing run of guests who engage in an hour-long conversation with me during lunch hour, and people from all of the 6 offices of the firm can dial in, and much as people are dialed in tonight. And I have a robust, honest, authentic conversation about a subject, and all of the people in attendance are like flies on the wall. They just get to observe. And so it's a really authentic conversation, not a presentation. And so the guests have included people like Dr. Mindy Fullilove, who's a social psychiatrist, who wrote the book Root Shock, all the way to folks who are on the high design end of things. Pascal Sablon, who works for David Ajay, who's created the Beyond the Built Environment exhibit. All these wonderful people, been able to bring them to the table. Everything has to be with intention. So recruitment has to be focused, but not recruiting the way you did 2 years ago, recruiting with your eyes open in a different way. Partnership with NOMA has been great. The large firm roundtable, the 60 largest firms in the country, their CEOs bound together in this large firm roundtable, gave NOMA $50,000 2 years ago to then turn around and use to pay 25 students to do research projects in offices. We got a young man from Chicago he's a full-time employee at ZGF now. So, I mean, it works. I'm going to share two quickly pro bono projects, the 1+ program started by my friend John Peterson, which says you take 1% of your billable hours and you dedicate it to working with a nonprofit. If you're a sole proprietor, that means you're going to spend 20.8 hours working for a nonprofit. If you're a firm of 100, that's 208 hours, do the math. So we did a youth achievement center in Seattle, and you see my team on the top, and they were working with a group of youth, BIPOC youth, who we introduced to Jack Travis's 10 Principles of Afrocentric Design, which then they assimilated and made their own, and came out with a lot of sort of approaches that we were able to develop further, and these design principles that became the lenses through which we evaluated all of the proposals, doing the programming and the kind of distribution of uses across these two sites, which were excess property from Sound Transit, which is the Seattle Transit Authority. They were building a metro station directly across the street from these sites, and they used that land for laydown area for materials and so forth. And when the project was done, they didn't need the land anymore, so they're going to convey that land to a nonprofit called Africa Town. And they're using our work. Dang, I keep touching this thing. There's some Italian in my roots. I talk with my hands, So we did the whole programming and space planning piece, and then the expression of that in the aesthetic terms that were kind of agreed upon and dictated by these wonderful young people that we worked with, who were really passionate about anyone driving by or walking by seeing this and knowing it was something special, it had a special intent, and it was theirs. So you see the elevation renders on the top. And so they're using this material now for fundraising, and they're moving this thing along. And there'll be an RFP for the full-on architectural services at some point. We may or may not go after it. We're not, this was not for that purpose. But if we end up getting it, fine, great. So when you hear this stuff about, cultural expression through architecture and design, these are designs developed by my white women colleagues. I mean, it's possible to just be sensitive to your client. Microsoft gets a certain look, Nike, Africa Town. And the one that really got a lot of publicity is the Latino Network project in Portland, where again, our folks worked with this group on a site that they had some issues of connectivity from existing facilities across the parking lot. And they worked, again, selflessly with the staff and with the constituents. And this was a great quote. Leave it here for a second for you to read. I think this sums up the motivation and how we can be gratified by doing this work. And so, you do the engagement, you get all the inputs, you create a word cloud from the words that appear most, and you then go back to that community of users and say, this is what we heard from you. Are we good? Did we get it right? And you have a little opportunity for course correction if not, but then that starts to work its way into a set of guiding principles, which then lead to adjacency bubble diagrams, blocking diagrams that take that program and really rationalize it in terms of physical space. Working through those issues with the user group using, cutout forms and shapes and moving stuff around. Precedent boards, which are very important. And I was just telling Laura's studio class about the need to assemble images of the kinds of projects that you want to do so that there's some reference and you can help use those to defend your project. And then organizing that material under these guiding principles. And then ultimately manifesting that in a design. And I think these nonprofits always can use renders to do fundraising. And in this case, we got some pretty good stuff. Very contextual for the Pacific Northwest, a lot of wood, CLT, mass timber throughout. And what fun. So here again, you all are mostly students, not firm owners, but these are, again, similar to what I presented before, specific steps that firms can take to become, to rid their structures of racism that's either covert, overt, or any other form. And then lastly, Whitney M. Young Jr., civil rights leader. He made a famous speech to the AIA back in '68, where he said, "You architects are not a profession that has distinguished itself by your social and civic contributions to the cause of civil rights. You are most distinguished by your thunderous silence and your complete irrelevance." Ouch, man. So there were like 12 of the people at that AIA conference were Black folks who got together at that moment and said, you know, we got to take control of this thing, and that's where NOMA was born. So as of, you know, a year ago, we're doing a little bit of this. Actually, it should have been September of 2021. We're still hovering under 2,500 licensed Black architects. Black women are on this sort of meteoric rise right now. There's more of them getting licensed quicker than just about any other group. But we still hover around 2% of the licensed architects in the country. We are 13, 14% of the general population. That just means that 2% of us are crazy enough to want to do this thing. So I don't know, we're trying to figure it out. Some of my colleagues who you probably never heard of and don't know are against all these odds, managing to deliver projects like this. Rainey Hamilton is office in Detroit, firm doing this. Phil Freelon, bless his heart, passed away from Lou Gehrig's disease a couple of years ago. He was my idol, my good friend, and he set the bar for design excellence, irrespective, but he found ways to express culture in an abstract, contemporary way. The lower left, the Harvey Gantt Center in Charlotte, North Carolina, emulating the G's Ben quilts. So there's a cultural nugget in there. It may not be apparent and obvious as when you see one of Jack Travis's pieces, it's more literal, like a kente pattern on the side of a brick building, and you say, oh yeah, I know what that is. But here you're like, something's going on, I'm not quite sure what it is, but it's that soul of the building that's there. Sean has now gone to the academic side, but he's done some really great theoretical work. My guys at Raw, I'm no longer with them, but they're still my guys, you know, did what we did. And of course, along with Phil Freelon was Max Bond, who was the patriarch for us and who passed away as well. He was alive and was key in winning the commission for the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and then passed away before it could be executed. But David Ajay takes most of the design credit. Phil Freelon had a large hand in that as well. But one way or the other, their firm, Stolen Lee, David Lee, taught at Harvard urban design for years and years, retired several years ago. Don Stoll just passed away. These guys are the old legacy Black-owned firms, and you can see cultural expression working its way into this work. And you may say, well, I don't understand where that came from, and they can tell you exactly where it came from. One of the contemporaries who's really hitting a stride right now is Michael Marshall in DC, and he's a Yale architect graduate, and he still believes in drawing everything by hand, and he trains all of his employees to draw with his hands, so all the work looks like it came from the same place. Pretty remarkable, award-winning guy. ZGF has partnered with Michael on several projects now. Caples and Jefferson did the Weeksville Center in New York City that won the AIA's Best of the Best Award, won NOMA awards. And then this project in the lower center is at the World Fair site in Queens. I'm done. So thank you very much.